Just give me a second to finish up the YouTube aspect. All right, that's working now. Just give it a minute while people finish logging in. As you can see, we are going to be looking at chapter 21 of the book of Devarim, Deuteronomy. And we'll be starting at the top of the chapter with verse 1. And this is a fascinating examination into a murder mystery. My little teaser for the day. All right, looks like the logins have stopped. So why don't we go ahead and get started? Good officially afternoon to everyone, as we just passed noon for our beginning of our Torah discussion today. As is always the case, we are going to be looking at a slice of Torah because the Parashat Shoftim, like all of the Torah portions, is simply too chock full of interesting things to cover entirely in 1 hour. It would not be doing any justice to any one of them, any one of the topics. And today's topic is about justice. Or is it? Like I said in the teaser, we are going to be looking at a murder mystery. Normally, if you have a murder mystery, you have that Perry Mason moment where, ta-da, the murderer is revealed and justice is served. In chapter 21, we are going to be looking at a case where we don't seem to catch the murderer. The murder goes unsolved. And that may leave you feeling a little bit dissatisfied. Just imagine if you were watching a TV show and they didn't catch the bad guy by the end. Well, in chapter 21, at the surface of it, the bad guy will not be caught. But we're going to talk about why this ceremony is here, despite the fact that the bad guy is not caught, and what the ultimate objectives are, both for this case as well as justice as a whole. With that as the extended trailer, let's get down to work. Like I said, we are in chapter 21, the book of Devarim, and we begin with the setting of the scene. If there be found a corpse on the land that Adonai your God is giving you to possess, fallen in the field, not having become known who struck it down. And again, great thanks to Everett Fox for the elegant translation, which tries to capture a little bit more of the nuances of the Hebrew. As always, every translation has its ups and downs, but here I think the flow is very striking. You find a corpse, there is a body, and the body is there on the land. And this is the land that God gave you. All of these elements building the scene, not only of the murder mystery, but also our place in this place, our having of the land as a gift that God has given us. And now here is this tragedy that is unfolding, a murder that seems to be unsolvable. Nobody knows how the person fell. This person was struck, and here their body lies, but nobody knows who did it. Verse 2, your elders and your judges are to go out and measure the distance to the towns that are around the corpse. All right. Nowadays, we would expect CSI, the crime scene investigators to rush out, cordon everything off with police tape, and begin looking for clues. Here, the only thing we're doing is figuring out which town is closest to the body as that was discovered. And it shall be that the town nearest to the corpse, the elders of that town are to take a she-calf of the herd, with which no work has ever been done, which has never pulled a yoke. The elders of that town are to bring down the she-calf to an ever-flowing wadi, which has never had work done on it and has never been sown, and are to break the neck of the she-calf there in the wadi. What? This eglah this female cow, this heifer, as is often used as a term. What are we doing here? Is this a ritual for discovering the murderer? Is this some form of a blood sacrifice for a reason that is yet unexposed? The intentionality, excuse me, it looks like my phone is going to be very interrupting. And so that means I'm going to put it on Do Not Disturb, because people can wait an hour before they can get a hold of me. That's okay. Remember, it's okay to make people wait a little to get a hold of you. If it's a real emergency, they'll find a way through. And if they can't, well, welcome to life 20 years ago when we didn't all have phones on us. Okay. And Torah shouldn't wait. So we have this situation where this eglah is being killed in a non-traditional manner. This is not a sacrifice at an altar. This isn't even being done like a sacrifice. It's not being slaughtered in the way that an animal would normally be slaughtered to become meat. And for some reason, it's the town close by that has this grisly duty. All of this is going to be part of our discussion. But before we get to that, it has to get a little bit stranger. Then they are to approach the priests, the son of Levi. These are the Kohanim. For Adonai, your God, has chosen them to attend on him and to give blessing in Adonai's name. And by their statement shall be settled, or shall be, every legal quarrel and every case of assault. So the Kohanim, as is very obvious from the rest of the book of Devarim, served in a judicial capacity. They were the rabbis of the day. They were the knowledgeable ones, and thus they knew the law and they knew how to apply the law. So they are being brought in at this case, not purely in a priestly fashion, but in a court type fashion. And all the elders of that town, the one nearest the corpse, are to wash their hands over the neck broken calf at the wadi. Then they are to speak up and say, our hands did not shed this blood. Our eyes did not see. O purge your people Israel that you redeemed, O Adonai. Do not put innocent blood amid your people Israel, so they shall be atoned of the blood. And so shall you yourself eradicate the innocent blood from your midst, for you are to do what is right in the eyes of Adonai. So this there's a quick question in chat. Is this the ceremony of the dead heifer instead of the red heifer? In a sense, yes, except in the red heifer, it's the para aduma, and here it's the eglah arufa. So it's the broken neck cow rather than the red cow. It doesn't quite rhyme the same way as your version did in chat. So we end up with this finale to the ceremony. Sorry, let me leave that on the page. Of a pronouncement as they wash their hands over the corpse of this animal here taken to this special place. They are proclaiming that they were not the murderers, which is definitely weird and something we're going to have to talk about. And in the process, this seems to be to eradicate the innocent blood from your midst and to somehow atone for the murder that took place. Now, it's an odd form of atonement because normally atonement happens when an individual who has committed the crime or transgression of some other form would come to the altar, would confess their sin, would offer a sacrifice in the normal way. That's normally how atonement happens, or communal atonement as outlined in Vayikra, Leviticus, most famously, of course, through the actions of the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, on Yom Kippur. Killing a cow in the middle of a riverbed because a body was found that couldn't be explained seems like an odd form of atonement. The person that needs atonement is surely the murderer, not a community that happens to be nearby. So all of this should be stirring a great many questions and dare I say even confusion. As hopefully you all have heard me say before, confusion is when we open ourselves up to actually learn, because if we don't feel confused, then we're not listening and we're not paying attention to things that will come to teach us something. So before we jump into our commentary, Any questions or comments here? Because we are finishing here on verse 9, because Kitetse begins with verse 10.
The issue of innocent blood residing in your midst. Are the commentaries going to draw our attention to Genesis 2, where the same thought is expressed, and the voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. So there's this polluting of something has to be done because this innocent blood is crying out for something.
So we're not going to be looking at commentaries that focus on that in particular, but your statement is definitely on theme. There is an understanding in Judaism that is perhaps sublimated through the modern understandings, that a crime is a crime, and especially a murder. The spilling of dam naki, of innocent blood, is something that needs to be responded to by the community. Indeed, the entire process of kapara, of atonement, both within the Mishkan as well as the individual, was trying to remove a pollution, a spiritual pollution that was either adhering to the individual or adhering to the community. Very important to remember that Judaism believes that pollution can always be removed. But here we are seeing what happens when there is a spiritual pollution of the land, of the community, that cannot be handled under the normal means. And in the modern world, we would generally say, oh, not my problem. I didn't do it. I don't think the elders did it. I'm not sure why we are trying to make atonement. In biblical Judaism and rabbinic understanding of it, we as a community still need to respond, even if we were not individually overtly responsible for the crime or for the transgression. So yes, the idea that I am my brother's keeper, as the response that should be answered, yes, you are your brother's keeper, from Bereshit, is absolutely at the heart of this, that we do have a responsibility to the deceased, even if we were not directly, overtly responsible for their death. So we're not going to go into that in much more detail, not quite, but thank you for bringing that reference. So let's see which commentaries Rabbi Neely did choose to bring, because as you can imagine, there are hundreds of different things that are shared from our sages over the last 2,000, 3,000 years about this topic. But every week I have to pick just a few for us to study. As always, the more you learn, you'll learn that there are many other ideas to be gleaned from any section of Torah, but these are the ones that we'll be sharing today. So let's first talk about the placement of this particular section, paragraph really, in the text. And this explanation comes from Ibn Ezra. As scripture mentions the war against enemies, it goes on to say what the law is if one who fights against his fellow and a corpse is found in the land of Israel, and the one who slew him is unknown. So Ibn Ezra is trying to say, look, we've been talking about war, and now we're talking about a body. But this is a slightly different topic, but one that should still be connected to the previous topic. That when we fight, we normally think of our fighting as being against a common external threat, a foe. Somebody has attacked our country and we are fighting back to defend ourselves. And of course, there is going to be death, there is going to be loss of life, and all of the other issues that the Torah discusses for how we conduct ourselves during war, some of which we have talked about quite recently. But, says Ibn Ezra, you should also remember while thinking about fighting that sometimes the fighting is close to home, and sometimes the fighting is not the noble protection of our people against foreign invaders. Sometimes the fighting is one Jew murdering another Jew. And this is something that also has to be handled. And yes, we have the procedure for what to do if it is a overt murder of one person by another. We know what to do in that case with witnesses and procedure. But when the body is just found, well, it is a stark reminder that Israel, the people of Israel, we are like other peoples in many respects. That unfortunately, crime, even murder, does happen in our place, and as such, it needs to be dealt with. There is nothing to be gained by pretending that the only death that will happen will be only from protective wars. There will be death that comes at the hands of Jew against Jew for no good reason. And this is what we're going to have to do to try and resolve that situation. It's one of those great sayings, that the Jews are like other people, only more so. We are not free from crime. When people often say, well, Jews don't commit crimes, I like to point out to them, go to Israel, there are prisons full of them, and for the entire range of crime. I wish it were true that no Jew committed crime, but as the Torah is clearly stating, as Ibn Ezra is confirming, and as we know from our personal experience, Jews will commit every crime. Not every Jew, though, will do so. So we now know this crime is relevant. It is relevant to us. But there is a little bit of a pushback on that, as we see in Sifrei from the Midrash Halacha, reading the text very carefully. If there be found, our phrase, and not if there were generally found, meaning that the Sifrei is trying to emphasize the ifness of the finding, that this is not a when it is found, but an if it is found, meaning that bodies like this should not be commonplace. Yes, crime will happen and murder too among the Jewish population, but it should not be a commonplace activity. It should never be something that is happening daily. In fact, if the body is found near the border, meaning with another country, or near a city inhabited by a majority of non-Jews, then where it was stated when murderers proliferated, the breaking of the heifer's neck was abolished. In fact, in those circumstances, we do not follow the ritual, as is very clear from the rest of the halakha, which we don't have time to go into. The rabbis found many exceptions to this particular ritual, and it was not implemented except under the most specific of circumstances. But one of those circumstances was that the body had to be found in an area where we would not be more likely to assume that it was killed by a cross-border raid or was killed by a non-Jew. And I know that that may sound a little chauvinistic, but please remember we are talking about 2,000 plus years ago, in particular by rabbis who lived during the time of Roman occupation, where the murder of our people by the Roman army and Roman civilians was commonplace and often completely ignored by the Roman authorities. And Jewish people were routinely butchered, murdered, and tortured in heinous ways. And so their opinion of the non-Jewish world really reflects their opinion of the Roman oppressors. Indeed, all of the nations that had been around Israel at one time or another had tried to attack and murder us. So we kind of got it into our head that that's what non-Jews are like. Thankfully, in the modern world, we live among non-Jews, and they are not constantly trying to murder us, which is very grateful. But this ritual was designed to handle exceptional cases. And if it became commonplace, whether by Jewish murderers or by non-Jewish murderers, then we know that even while the temple still stood, this whole ceremony was abolished. This is not meant as an answer to widespread bloodshed. This is meant as an answer to the rare and exceptional case of a murder happening that couldn't be brought to justice in the normal means. All right. Sefer HaChinuch, the next few paragraphs here, is going to try and give us a little bit more context of why we're actually doing this ritual, because so far the ritual is still a little baffling. Yes, the ritual was rare. Yes, we should expect that this kind of thing will happen, but why this ritual for its resolution? It seems so different than everything else the Torah talks about. And thus, Sefer HaChinuch, reading from Rambam as well as from the Gemara and the Talmud, is going to try and interpret the meaning behind the different steps of our ritual. The roots of the mitzvah are in order that the heart of the people be aroused in their seeing this great procedure, the gathering of the elders of the city and its great men. And they take a cow, which is a large animal, and they go to outside of the city in assembly and with masses, since everyone wants to see these things. So the first thing he keys in on is the fact that this ritual is going to be a spectacle. people are going to be gathered and say, look, all the important people are getting together. Look, they've got a cow. You can see this cow walking out on the leash, and they're going outside the city. It's not just an everyday in-city discussion at the courts. This is the kind of thing that people would be gathering around to go witness. And all of the listeners will tremble at the sound of its killing, and their thoughts about the thing will be stimulated. And immediately the heart of anyone who knows about the matter will be astounded, and his thinking will be aroused to say that which he knows in front of the elders. So the implication of that is that you will have gathered the vast majority of the people nearby, the ones that are most likely to either know something or to have actually committed the act. And by bringing everybody out through the solemn and impressive spectacle, you are more likely to get somebody who might have been sitting on their hands or unwilling to share evidence to finally spill the beans, to say what they know. Whether it is enough or not, we're not sure, but at least they'll finally give the information they have. And through this, the evil ones and the murderers will be destroyed from among them. And besides this knowledge, there is much benefit in this great procedure, to show and to publicize among the masses with great publicity that the desire of the elders and intelligent people is to find the murderer and to exact vengeance from him for the vengeance of the murderer. So in addition to maybe stirring some actual evidence to be brought to light, maybe getting somebody to, if they're not confessing, at least share information that they have, there is also just the civic duty of telling people, we want to catch murderers. That if somebody died and they are, and we don't already know who did it, we want to. That every death is so important, every death is so sacred, that we will do everything we can to try and uncover who the murderer was and see that they are brought to justice. It is a great tragedy in the modern world when many people will treat a story of a death as being just, oh, one of those things. And even though murder now is less common than it used to be, and a lot less common than most of us imagine, nonetheless, we still treat those exceptional modern murders as though they were just, oh, it's one of those things, nothing I need to worry myself about. Imagine if instead all of us took to heart that the murder of one person is like the loss of the entire world, and that we would want to move heaven and earth to uncover the truth of the matter and bring the murderer to justice. That, says Sefer HaChinuch, is really the impetus between doing the ceremony in this way. It is not enough to just do kapara, to atone for the death. It is not enough to just ask around if people know who did the murder. We have to make sure the whole community knows we are committed to stamping out this type of behavior and to bringing to justice whoever committed the crime. Now, on that point, he then goes on to explain one more point of halacha. If there were two towns there, one of which was closer and one of which was not closer, but there is a greater multitude of people there than in the closer one, we go after the further one that has many people. As so did they, may their memory be blessed, say in the Gemara, in a case where one can decide based on majority or proximity, one goes after the majority. And even though majority and proximity are both from Torah writ, meaning that the Torah commanded us to consider proximity and majority, majority is preferred. And this is discussed in other parts of Jewish law. But the impetus here is that we go to the larger city, even if there was a closer small city, because all things being equal, we would expect the larger city is more likely to either contain the actual murderer or to contain a person who has some information which might be relevant to the solving of the murder. It's to be important that you notice from this part of Sefer HaChinuch that even though the elders are washing their hands over this, which has now become an idiom for removing themselves of responsibility, that they are not actually removing all responsibility. Yes, they are declaring that they did not do that, which we'll talk about in just the next text. But more importantly, we have to realize they are saying, if we are able to find the murderer, even though we have done the actual ceremony, we are still going to prosecute the case. That our duty is not done, that the ceremony is actually the intensification of the investigation. It is not the end of the investigation. And that's why they want the majority, the larger city to be the one involved in this, because it gives a better chance of solving the case. Now, on those 2 points that I mentioned in passing, we have Rashi to thank for summarizing our tradition's opinion. But would it enter anyone's mind that the elders of the court are suspect of bloodshedding? Why are they the ones saying we did not murder him? Why are they the ones washing hands over the corpse of the cow? I mean, are they suspects, really? But the meaning of the declaration is, we never saw him and knowingly let him depart without food or escort. Meaning, if we had seen him, we would not have let him depart without these. That they are saying that we are not responsible, of course, directly, but we are also not responsible indirectly for him having been murdered. We did not let him come and leave without an escort, which would have made him vulnerable, nor did we allow him to come and leave without proper provisions, which might have made him likely to commit violence against another in order to feed himself. That we have a responsibility to make sure that nobody is put in a position where they are either vulnerable and unprotected, nor under-provisioned, and thus more likely to resort to crime. The elders are saying they are running their town in a way to mean that this sort of behavior should not be a natural occurrence. Again, going back to our very first text from Ibn Ezra, our second text rather from Sifrei, that this is something that should be a rare occurrence. And that means the town is doing everything it can through both protection as well as support to make sure that this sort of thing is rare. And then again, Rashi goes on to tell us that this, meaning their ceremony, teaches that if the murderer is found after the heifer's neck was broken, he must nevertheless be put to death through proper trial and procedure. But just because we have done the ceremony of the agla arufa, the broken neck heifer, does not mean that the murderer can now confess with impunity and that witnesses could come forward and the murderer would not be taken and properly tried. This is not the end. This does not let the murderer off the hook, so to speak. This is about the community, but not about the murderer, him or herself. They are still responsible for their deeds, and they will still be held accountable, either by the community, should they get the information to do so, or by the one who judges all. And all of us will stand in that courtroom eventually. Any questions or comments before we get into that court discussion? Because there may be a little bit of a tickling of a question of the efficacy of this ceremony, where we're trying to wheedle more information out of the population. And you might be wondering whether that information will be sufficient. After all, if we don't have two witnesses that already came forward, is having the big ceremony really going to get us closer to evidence that will allow us to actually execute someone? And it's funny you were asking that, because wouldn't you know, my next text deals with that question directly. Rambam, this is a summary of the discussion about circumstantial evidence in Rabbi Blech's Great Contemporary Halachic Problems book, where he discusses, are we allowed to use circumstantial evidence in Jewish law, especially in capital cases? Generally speaking, in capital cases, we demand two eyewitnesses that meet a very high criteria for the testimony they give. That would seem to rule out a lot of the CSI type proof for somebody having committed murder. But there are exceptions to how Judaism views this. And one of those exceptions comes in the writings of Rambam. Rambam maintains that circumstantial evidence may be admitted in administering the king's justice. In his guide for the perplexed, Moreh Nevuchim, Rambam unequivocally states that the king may act on the basis of circumstantial evidence alone. In his discussion of the rationale underlying various mitzvot, Rambam advances a novel view regarding the purpose of the commandment concerning breaking the neck of the heifer, the Egla Arufah that we have been talking about. A ritual performed when a homicide victim is found outside the city limits and the perpetrator is unknown. The purpose of this rite, according to Rambam, who was the inspiration for Sefer HaChinuch, is to publicize what has transpired so that anyone having information concerning the identity of the murderer will come forward, as we've discussed. As Rambam states, when the murderer is discovered, the benefit of the law is apparent, for even if the Beit Din cannot sentence him to death, meaning they lack the necessary level of evidence of eyewitnesses to make that a possibility, the king may execute him, for the king may execute by circumstances and by analogy. That is to say, on the basis of what we would call circumstantial evidence. And if the king of evidence does not execute him, the avenger of blood, meaning that the next of kin that has the right to handle this in the case where justice has been denied would legally be allowed, under Rambam's opinion, and there is debate on that, to extract the penalty against the murderer, even on the basis of circumstantial evidence. Now, this tries to answer the question of what good would that ceremony be of getting more information if that information may not meet the evidentiary criteria for prosecuting somebody under a capital case. And Rambam is explaining that, yes, it is true that a Beit Din, meaning a court made up just of dayanim, of rabbis who have been appointed to handle these types of cases, but lacking the executive authority to carry out an execution, which has been the case for most of our history over the last 3,000 years. There have been only a few periods where we have that level of authority vested in the hands of the courts. Nonetheless, that authority is vested in the hands of the kings. The rabbis were quite liberal in the giving of authority to the king to act in ways that might supersede the limits of judicial action by the actual rabbis. So the king would have the ability to have that type of justice carried out. We see a very clear example of that in the story of Solomon and the proposed bisection of a baby, where the king had the authority to make life or death decisions, as it was necessary for the king to do, not only in judicial settings, but for things like war. So here Rambam is taking that as saying, yes, under the right circumstances, even lesser quality testimony or evidence could be enough for a properly appointed king to carry out the death sentence on a murderer who might otherwise get away with it. Questions or comments before we move to an alternative explanation for why all of this is taking place?
In modern American law, we use circumstantial evidence all the time whenever it's a lab result. You mentioned CSI, that's technically circumstantial evidence, but the legal fiction we tell ourselves is the evidence testifies for itself. Like when Jacob's presented with a bloody, torn jacket that belonged to Joseph, the testimony, the evidence testifies for itself. There's been a terrible accident and probably a dead person.
And exactly like the story of Jacob is or Joseph's coat is the reason why Judaism is very suspicious in general of circumstantial evidence, because that coat was presented as evidence that Joseph had died, when we know, the readers, that Joseph is alive and not so well on his way down to Egypt to become a slave. So that circumstantial evidence was used to cover up a crime rather than to expose an actual crime, which is why Judaism does strongly prefer properly vetted testimony as being the foundation. But as in American law, we know there are many crimes that would go unanswered if the only evidence we had was eyewitness testimony. Sometimes the facts of the matter can be marshaled together to create a conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt. But there's a reason why we use the reasonable doubt criteria, because technically the evidence is being presented, but it cannot speak for itself. It is just suggestive of the conclusion. And that is indeed why in Judaism we have not used circumstantial evidence for the majority of our decision making. Only with a properly appointed king was that allowed, or in a few other extraordinary circumstances. All right. Now we're going to look at a much longer quote from Rabbeinu Bachya, and this quote I love, and I wish I could have brought the entirety of it, but there's no way we would have had time because he was quite lengthy in it. But I highly recommend you go back to the Torah and look, or to Sefaria for this part of the Torah, look up his commentary, because he walks through both legal and rational and midrashic and Kabbalistic understandings of this entire ceremony. And it's a great example of how we can look at the same thing from multiple different points of view and gain important insights that can guide us in many different ways that ultimately have nothing to do with the particular case. None of us are going to be in a position where we need to measure to the town and we need to stand over the corpse. That is not a ceremony that is in place at this time. But all of us can learn nonetheless in many different facets of things that would be relevant to our perspective on life as well as our perspective on justice. So with that in mind, the next paragraphs are all from Bachya's analysis. The reason why all of this has to take place in the town nearest the slain person is that, in our estimation, the murderer comes from that city, or that people of that town had been guilty of a similar crime. Otherwise, such a disaster would not have happened near their town. So notice how he is putting both a very sort of logical, common idea. The reason why the town is doing it is because that town is probably the home for the murderer. It's just playing the odds. And then he juxtaposes that with a spiritual insight that indeed the town might be guilty. Yes, we said before that the people were saying we didn't do it, but the town might have committed similar crimes. That town might be guilty. If not, why would this disaster have happened near them? Now, this can be read both logically, like Rashi did, meaning that maybe the town let the person go back out into the wilderness without giving them proper provisions or without giving them proper protection, at which case they are partially responsible for the death. Or this can be seen in a more mystical light, that the town itself had committed other crimes that were similar to this, whether it would be starving somebody to death or causing other people to be hurt or injured in their travels. And now that crime is being exposed by the arrangement of the body near to their town. It is forcing them to rethink their past and their general behavior. Then he moves into the Midrash. A Midrash based on Soda 46, meaning the Talmud, God said, "Let the yearling calf whose neck is broken serve as a symbol and have her neck broken in a place which will not produce fruit, any produce." Remember, this was a strip of land along the wadi, the river flow, that had not and could not ever be used now for growing. In order to atone for the slain person whose life has been cut short, so that he will no longer be able to produce fruit. This is a way of trying to conceptualize for the people that the loss of this person is not just a body in the field, but the loss of this person is the loss of whatever they might have contributed, whatever was in them and their life, whatever good they could have given, that fruit is gone. Whether it had been their own deeds, whether it had been the deeds of their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, whoever it was, however it was, they had more to give to this world, and they have been obliterated so that that gift can never be given. As such, we should recognize in the the performing of the procedure in a place that has not yet given fruit, that fruit is now lost for all time. That area becomes off limit for produce for all time. Again, as I said before, you can really feel the emphasis throughout all of our commentary that no murder should ever be treated lightly, that no matter who the person is, no matter what you think of their background or the life choices they made that brought them to that place or anything else, their death is the loss of fruit for not just them, but for the community and for the world. If not for them directly at that moment in their life, then something they might have done later. And if not for something they might have done, something their children, grandchildren, or others might have done. That the loss of any person is a loss for all of us. And then he switches back to more of the rational explanation of why this procedure has the details that it does. A rational approach to the legislation. The calf, which is being killed, is a similar phenomenon to the scapegoat, which is killed after it symbolically carries the sins of the entire Jewish people, as we see in Leviticus 16, which talks about the Yom Kippur service. Both wind up in a totally barren environment, Bamidbar, in the case of the scapegoat, out in the wilderness, and here, a place that has never been plowed and never been used and now never will be. So in both cases, the animal which is symbolically carrying the guilt is being put to rest in a place that is completely barren. All, meaning this as well as the scapegoat, and he also talks about the one of the doves used for the purification of tzara'at, all have as their purpose to blunt possible accusations by spiritually negative forces which abound in the world and which look for any excuse to assume the role of prosecuting attorney against the Jewish people. Now, you may be thinking, spiritually negative forces, that doesn't sound very rational to me. And yes, we have a different definition of rationality than perhaps Bachya and other people did in the past. But understand what he is trying to say here is that if we do not respond, if we do not act in a way that shows that we have nothing to do with this sin, that we have nothing to do with the guilt, that we are going to redouble our efforts to make sure such things can't happen, then we stand vulnerable to accusations against us of failing to live up to the proper role that God has asked us to play in the world. And that means that we are now vulnerable to accusations. Indeed, the word Satan, often pronounced Satan in modern English, unfortunately, means this prosecuting attorney, this adversary, which is not demonic and evil and looking for souls, but is trying to tell God to hold us accountable, to hold us to a strict level of justice. And here, if we fail to show that we are concerned and are willing to do all that is necessary to try and deal with this crime, then that Satan, that adversary, can point at us and say, look at them, God. Somebody died and they didn't care. Somebody died and they did nothing. Somebody died and they didn't even act like it was partly their responsibility. These are people that you do not deserve to show compassion or mercy towards. So we must act in a way which would silence that kind of accusation. That when something tragic happens, even if we cannot come up in our own imagination with any way that we might have been responsible for it, nonetheless, we must acknowledge that something has to be done or said or acted on in a way that would show that we care and that we will do what we can to prevent. The lack of response to a tragedy is to open the gate to being accused of some form of complicity in its perpetration, or complicity in any further acts that are of similar type. That when it is brought to our attention that something is wrong, we have to, at the very least, perform a ritual which shows that we are willing to make sacrifices to prevent such things, willing to do what can be done to avoid such things. At the very least, we have to make the public display so that everybody understands that we do consider it wrong and tragic. And if we cannot be bothered to get up off our seat and do at least that, then honestly, we deserve the harsh criticism that Bachya is talking about here. And then one more aspect, this time, of what this whole procedure reveals about the soul that every living thing has, well, and humans in particular. There is yet another aspect embodied in these procedures, and that is that they teach us something about the nature of a murdered person, about this human being that is dead. The procedures leading to the atonement of this crime comprise three elements: the breaking of the calf's neck, the location where this has to take place, meaning the totally barren area which has never been useful, and the recital of a confession by the priests. Our hands did not spill this blood. Please atone for your people Israel. The murderer achieved his objective only by means of separating, detaching his victim from three souls. What Bachya is referring to here is the notion in Judaism that our soul is not just one block, one amorphous Casper-looking ghost that is wedged inside of our body, but that our soul is made up of different levels of energy. And there are traditionally seen to be three different levels to that energy. We know that the first soul, which departs from a slain person, is the animalistic soul. Right? This is the basic soul that gives us our animal mobility, vitality. It is the part that makes us get up and walk around and live as you would normally consider an animal to live. This is why the Torah selected a calf for this procedure, seeing that it, meaning the mother, symbolizes animalism. Killing it removes that soul. We are showing that this soul was killed from the murdered person. This animal soul, this basic level of a person, is gone. The location, one that does not produce any growth, symbolizes the vegetable soul. That is to say, through its absence, it represents the fact that also that soul, the basic form of life that is shared between us and animals and every plant that is on earth, that miracle of life that just allows for the creation of life in and of itself, even if it doesn't rise to the level of full animalhood, let alone humanity, that soul too has been removed, destroyed by the brutal act of murder. And finally, the confession and request for atonement symbolize the loss of the abstract soul of the slain person. This is more of the soul that most of us think of when we say soul, the actual person, the identity, the fullness of what it is to be a human. That soul too was destroyed through the act of murder. And we have a procedure here that not only atones for the loss of all of these parts of a person when murder takes place, but reminds every person that is participating, or even just those of us that are studying it, about the multi-layered beauty and gift that God has given to us through our soul and to the world around us, to look on the world as something sacred and beautiful, gleaming with the gift of God's life and God's light, and something that needs to be protected and sheltered and nurtured in every possible way. And that is something that would be not as easy to see if this procedure didn't exist or existed in another form. I know that some parts of the Torah can be very confusing and can feel very alien, almost bizarre to us. But when we look carefully, and especially when we are guided by the beautiful insights of our ancestors, we can recognize that there is so much for us to learn and take away from this. And so much of it is relevant to our own personal spiritual life, but also to our community life. No, we may not be measuring the distance to the corpse. We may not be breaking the neck on behalf of a community in exactly this way at this time, but all of us can still feel a responsibility for the loss of life in our community. All of us can still feel the pain and tragedy for the loss of that soul in this world. And all of us can do what we can to try and promote justice and try to promote a society where indeed, as Sifrei said, such things should be rare and not become the norm. God forbid we ever become callous or take these things as just being a natural course of life. They are the opposite of life, the antithesis of life, and we must always remark on them as being such and do everything we can to make sure they are rare. And that will finish the formal part of our study. But as always, I like to leave open a little time for questions or comments from all of you.
Rabbi, I remember a class of yours some years ago on Manasseh, who shed much innocent blood. And your conversation kind of ended on the same note, where when the culture starts seeing the taking of human life as another thing, another daily thing that we just accept, that it can quickly build up. And here we're being reminded that, take take it seriously when someone is killed in your area. This is serious. You know, do not be indifferent to one another.
Exactly. And I think, partly from Sefer HaHinuch, one of the things of bringing the cow out as being the largest, and if it being an unworked cow, one of the more expensive of the animals that would have been there, is to remind people who would look at that and say, why are you wasting this cow? This is expensive. This is a big loss. Is to also remind people, if you think that way about a cow, then you should also be thinking that way about a human being. That if you are boggled at why should this cow die, then you should be even more astounded that somebody thought this human being should die. And if you are not as equally outraged by the murder as you are by the sacrifice of the cow, then you've got your priorities in a very bad shape, and you need to rethink that. But unfortunately, many of us would look at the loss of a building as being more tragic than the loss of the people in that building. And that is something that I think the Torah is definitely trying to warn us against, and through this ritual guide us to avoid that kind of materialism, which devalues people so barbarically.
Well, we forget heifers have so much economic value because they can still give 6 to 7 calves, which would have future generations. It's the foundation of a herd. Within 12 to 15 years, you'd have a small herd based on this one heifer, hundreds of gallons of milk, hundreds of pounds of cheese, a lot of people being fed, a lot of money being made.
Right. There's so much fruit to come from this animal, and it's being taken away, just like there is so much to come from every human life, and this one has been taken away. And that is the tragedy, and something that we all have to respond to.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining me, both on Zoom as well as on YouTube. I look forward to studying again with you next week.